All right, let's get started. So in this series, I'm going to build a very sort of simple chat application following the Reddit style of organization where people can enter excuse me, enter chat rooms, which are called subs in Reddit terminology, and they can post a comment, reply to comments, things like that. It's not going to be a total replication, just like the Instagram clone. It's not going to be a full replication, but it's going to incorporate the key ingredients of creating a room, posting comments, replying to comments. This one will be a little bit more in depth than the Instagram clone. I'm basically progressing in complexity with my projects. So this one will also include user authentication, registration, things like that. So it's going to be one step further along, but it will not be React Redux. It's going to be a simple version. And next week, I'll probably redo this in a pure React Redux style application. So, so yeah, it won't be overly complex. So you're going to need an account on Turbo. So you probably know that by now. And you're going to need the Turbo CLI. So make sure you have those tools installed. I'm going to navigate to my desktop, and let's create a project locally on our desktop. So let's go with Turbo New, and let's call it Chat App. cd into the Chat App, and then run the npm install. If you do not have the Turbo CLI, you need to do sudo npm i-g turbo CLI. Ali, the purpose of the CLI is to connect your local source code to your remote project on your Turbo account. So we're going to host our project on Turbo. So the CLI is your conduit between your local source code and your environment on Turbo. It's actually just like the Heroku CLI. So it's pretty similar in that regard. So we need it for deployment, basically, in today's project. So if you don't have the Turbo CLI, do that, and you should be set to go. Okay, so here our npm installs are complete. Let's run the dev server just to make sure the project properly scaffolded. Run localhost. And here is our project scaffold, the default. And let's go ahead and do what we did last time. Let's set up the project on our Turbo account and deploy it just to make sure that that environment works as well. And then we can begin the actual coding. So head over to your dashboard and create a corresponding app here. Call it Reddit clone for the description. Grab the app ID, copy that. Yeah, Ali, yeah, to create a new application, it's Turbo, new, chat, app, like that. Okay, and then you cd into the project and run npm install, and that's where we are right now. And then once you have the project created on your account, grab the app ID, copy that, and then go back to your terminal and do Turbo app, paste in the app ID like so. And this will connect your Turbo project to your remote environment so that we can deploy, which we're going to do right now just to make sure it works. So just do Turbo deploy, and we will confirm that everything works on local and on staging. And for those of you who've been using Turbo for a while, be aware that down the road, I am going to spin off the Turbo service into its own thing called Vertex. That's going to be its own service. Basically, it's going to be a concurrent service I run alongside Turbo. And Turbo will be strictly focused on the tutorials and learning material and things like that. So that's probably about 2 months away. So here is the staging link to your staging environment once the deploy is complete. So go ahead and copy that and then paste it into your browser and make sure that it works on staging as well. And that way we can be confident that everything works locally as well as remotely, and we're ready to begin coding. So make sure everyone has that ready to go. I'll sort of pause to make sure everyone's caught up. So this application is going to be essentially a simplified, stripped-down version of Reddit. There will be user registration, authentication, which is we're going to work on that today. There will be, we're going to call it rooms, which is what Reddit calls subs. A room is basically a chat room organized into a topic. So a room might be like sports, another room might be fashion, another room might be politics. These are rooms in our project. And again, if you're a big Reddit guy, these are synonymous to subs. So we're going to have rooms. In the Reddit architecture, there's basically two kinds of posts. There's an original post and there are replies. So in our project, we want to call topic, that's going to be an original post. And then we're going to have reply. And these are just basically replies to topics. So a topic will consist of basically two things. Well, I mean, it's going to be more, but the two primary things are the title and then the description. So if you actually go to Reddit, try to keep this rated PG and better. So let's go to Reddit programming. We probably all belong to that sub. So programming. Here is this will be, this is a blog post. So we're not going to do external links, at least not for now. So our programming would be the room in our project. A topic would be the initial, these are all topics. So this would be a topic, this is a topic, and then replies are going to be all of these, right? So these are going to be the replies, okay? So the reason I'm pointing this out is because these are effectively going to be the resources of our project. And we're going to structure this like a conventional sort of startup application, which revolves around a REST API. And we're going to serve our data via a REST API, or at least set up a REST API for the data, revolving around these resources, and one more, which is the most important one, of course, the user. So these are going to be the primary resources around which our project is based on. So we want to begin with the API first, and then build out the UI, the actual corresponding UI on the front end to support these resources against the API. This is a very conventional structure for web applications and basic projects. Although that's changing right now, things are moving away from this a little bit. It's not quite critical mass yet, but as new technologies and new paradigms arise, this is becoming more and more, circa 2010 or so. Like, it's now moving more towards a GraphQL structure. My prediction is that within 5 years, around 5 years from now, REST APIs won't be as common, and it'll be more structured on a Graph API type of thing. But that's for another session. That's not for today. Right now, this is still the norm. So until further notice. So hopefully everyone's ready. Hopefully that gave enough time for people to get their code base up and running. Run the dev server again. Go to localhost and make sure you see this. So let's go ahead and set up the data for this project, which again is going to revolve around these 4 resources. So first thing we should do is create a mechanism through which people can actually sign up. So let's go ahead and open up the project. So let's see here. Here it is, chat app. So let's open this guy up. And here is our project scaffold, which is basically a very, very primitive Node Express application. using the Mustache templating engine. The templates are in the views directory. The public directory is where all these static assets are stored. So CSS, JavaScript images, typical static assets. Our app.js here is where you see the sort of the Express setup, the Express instantiation essentially. And again, this is like the simplest iteration of that. The routes are where the actual request routes are handled, and the index route is the one that's servicing the home page. So this is the one. This is where we're going to begin. Specifically, this route right here, line 9, is the one that's servicing our current home page. So that would be this right here. So let's get rid of everything else. Just like before, we want to make this an ES6 function. So it doesn't really matter, but it's just a matter of being consistent. That's all. Let's get rid of this data placeholder. Let's pass in null for the entire object. Oops, excuse me. Okay, and this render command right here is rendering the index right here, which is a direct reference to the index mustache template right here. So let's go ahead and start cutting all this down. So let's get rid of this guy. Let's get rid of, I'm basically just removing everything except that welcome to Turbo thing right here. Let's call it welcome to chat app, like that. And let's see here. Let's get rid of this block of text. And let's set up a form for user registration. So right away, we're going to handle user authentication, registration, get all that stuff set up. And then we will move on to the other resources, the rooms, topics, and comments. So this is going to be a text input. We'll go with username and password only for now. We do have Bootstrap automatically installed in the scaffold, so we can give it a Bootstrap class. I'm going to use form control. And username and password, it should be enough for registration. Let's put in a button here. Join. Okay, great. Let's see how this looks and make sure it looks the way we expect. So hopefully we see just a sign up form here, and that's it. So let's go ahead and confirm that. So let's see. Oh, it's already running. So here we go. So let's get some placeholders in here. So otherwise it's hard to tell what's what. So placeholder, username. And password. Okay, great. So now we have a username password form. That's good. Notice how the password is already obscured. That's because we're using the password type right here, which obscures the text, which is good. And then let's go ahead and register a user. So what we want to do is create a route to send this form to. We need to get a route to send the user registration data to in order to create a user. So I'm going to create a new route for this called auth, the auth route, which will handle all of the user authentication requirements. So it's going to be registration, log in, log out, and some basic session management for this, right? So let's go ahead and set that up right now. So let's go ahead and create a new route in this directory. So head over to the routes directory. Let's create a route called auth. head back to the root directory in your terminal, and then inside the auth route, for now, let's copy and paste the index route just directly into it. And then let's remove this, what's currently in there. And let's do a post, right? Because when you submit a form, it should be a post. It's usually a post, I should say. And then let's call it the path. Let's call it register, right? And then here, let's just return some JSON confirmation. And then we're just going to return the request body right back to the client side, excuse me, so that we can visually confirm that the data is being successfully passed through. So from a post form, the data is stored in the request.body. So that we're just, oh, hey, fantastic. Glad you can join us. So that we can just visually see whether or not the data was successfully transferred over. So now we got to connect this route. So we head over to app.js, and we have to import it first. So that's going to be this guy right here. So we want to import that on line 10. And then we want to connect the route to a specific path. So that's going to be auth, and then like that. And then here we have the auth route connected to this path, which then is handled via this right here. So hopefully I didn't go too fast, but make sure you have this. So lines 10 and 15 are the two lines I just added right there, which connects the auth route to a specific path. So now we have a route that's dedicated to user authentication in the form of registration, logging in, and logging out, and managing the sessions that are related to that. So let's go ahead and test this guy now. So we want to go back to our index mustache, and the form now has an action that we can apply to it, which is going to be auth and register. So that's this handler right here. And then we want to send a method, include a method, which is going to be post, which is pretty much what every form should be. There are exceptions, but pretty much it's almost always a post. And then this should be type, this button should be type submit. I think it would automatically submit anyway, but just to be really sure, this will make it definite. So let's go ahead and run the dev server, and let's reload the page just to make sure we have all a fresh render. So now, before we actually run this test, we want to be sure what constitutes success and failure, right? So one of the most common mistakes I see from beginners is they just start testing right away without really understanding what they're looking for. And so as a result, sometimes it succeeds and the person might not know it, right? Because they didn't clarify what constitutes success and failure. So in order for this to be successful, it has to hit this endpoint and return this JSON. So we should see a JSON object on the browser that says success, and then simply the username and password that we passed in from the template. Anything else other than that would be failure. So let's go ahead and try it. So let's try, okay. So when I press this, there is the exactly what I was looking for, the JSON with the data that I passed into the form field, and including the confirmation success. So in other words, this route is has been successfully connected, and therefore we can confidently proceed that the data we're passing through the template is being received on this route, and we can start doing some actual logic with it. So now from here, let's do exactly that. Let's actually create the user. So we're going to use the Turbo data store for that, because that's why Turbo exists. So let's go ahead and grab the Turbo SDK, which is line 2, right? And then we want to do create user. And that just takes a JSON object with the username and password. It could also be an email. And then this returns a promise. So we want to set up a promise chain with a success and error block like we normally do. And then inside the success, we want to send back the success confirmation. And And then inside the error, we want to send back an error confirmation. So there should be fail. And then we should send back a corresponding message with that error. So here is the Turbo SDK command for creating a user. Now, there's no way you would know that unless you're familiar with the SDK. So there's a couple resources that you can use to look things up. The documentation is right here. It's included in the scaffold, so you can go there to see how certain APIs work. Here is the Turbo documentation, and here we're using user management, and we're using specifically this function right here, that API call right there. It's, as you can see, it's a very simple API call. Just create user, pass in the user characteristics. There's sort of a cheat sheet inside every project as well called this file right here, documentation MD, which has not all the commands, but a lot of the more commonly used commands. So it's a bit of a cheat sheet for very commonly used commands like create user and things like that. So here we're using the create user command. I don't think I even have that one in here. So right here, create user. So so those are two quick resources you can look up for basic functions. So we're using the create user one. So let's go ahead and test it out now. So I'm going to reload the server. And let's go ahead and go back to the home page. Okay, now this time we have to redefine success and failure. Very important, again, to understand what constitutes success and what's failure when you're testing. Otherwise, you're just going to confuse yourself because you might mistake one for the other, which is very, very common. So here we have our create user function. And then upon success, actually, I miswrote this. It should be data right here. So this data object right here is the completion handler for the promise. In other words, this is the data of the created user. So this data object here on the response JSON in success should have a little bit more data. It should have a like a user ID, like a database key, things like that. Things that like a timestamp, things that clearly indicate that this is database-driven data and not just re-rendering sort of client-side data. So anything other than this would be considered failure. So let's hope that we see that. So let's go ahead and run that test. So let me reload the page. Run James. Okay, so now we have the success callback, right? But look at the data. It's got a few more things. Like we've got the username, obviously. We've got the timestamp, which is a good sign. I mean, this is from the database itself, and a unique identifier. Notice also, by the way, what we don't have is the password. The password was not passed back by the Turbo service as a default safety mechanism, so that you don't automatically expose your passwords by mistake. Turbo does also hash the passwords on your behalf, so you don't have to worry about that. All that stuff is taken care of for you. So now if you go to your Turbo dashboard and click on the project that we're working on and click on data store, you will see the user that we just created. This is the same user. So if I click on this, I can edit some of the properties. And once again, notice how there's no password. The password is always concealed, so that even you as the proprietor of the project can't see your user's passwords. So you have to set up like a password reset, you know, the proper way if a user forgets their password, which by the way will happen. So this worked. This was successful. So we have we've created a user successfully, our first user. So hopefully you guys got that working. I'm going to create one more just for good measure. Okay, so here it is. Same callback, same data, you know, data properties. It looks the same. And if I go back to my Turbo dashboard and I reload, I check the data store. Here we have both of our new users. Everything looks good. This is now working as expected. So now we have user registration properly working, which is great. So that's good. So now we can move on to the next thing, which is user login, right? So we want to be able to log a user in. So what we want to do is create another, go back here and let's create a header for register. And then let's create another form just for login. So I just copied that and change the button to login, and that's it. So it's basically the same thing. I'm going to put a little bit of a line break right here. Okay, so if I reload this page, the home page, now I have register and login, right? These are just test forms. So clearly this is not a very nice looking UI. We will take care of that later. Right now we're just setting this up purely for the purposes of testing. And then once we confirm that, we will eventually replace all this with the more elegant UI. So let's go ahead and set up the proper functions for logging in. So we don't want to register on login, right? Obviously, that's not what we're going for. So we want to create another route, or really just another handler for logging in. So I'm creating another handler right now, except instead of register, it'll be login. And just like before, I'm just gonna bounce it back with some JSON, and that's it. Right. So we want to do just a quick, JSON confirmation. What am I doing? Just to make sure that the data is successfully passing through, right? So in other words, the same exact setup as the register path before we actually built it out. So then here, we want to do auth login and same everything else, right? So just username, password. So let's go ahead and try it out. So here I reloaded the page, and I'm going to do okay. And again, we have to clearly define success and failure. So we're not actually logging in. I hope that's self-evident. We're just bouncing the JSON right back to the client side. So when I do that, I get that. And that means the route is successfully connected, so we can proceed with confidence. So now let's go back to the actual auth route and reuse the Turbo SDK to log the user in. So here, the function is just log in. And we pass in the post parameters, like so. And then same as before, it just returns a promise. So we can actually just do pretty much the exact same thing, just set up the promise sequence. And let's pass back the data. Actually, I think it's literally identical at this point. So we could copy and paste, but we're going to make a few adjustments in a few minutes anyway. So, okay, so then here, we're using the login function from the Turbo SDK. And again, if you're not, there's no way you would know what functions to use without actually having some experience. If you check the documentation, you can just see the functions, right? So here we did that. Now we're doing login, and we have our success callback and our error callback. So we're just using that Turbo SDK function. So here, what I want to do is test a few scenarios. I want to test a user that doesn't exist. So try to log in as a user who is not found in the database. I want to try using the wrong password, and then I want to try successful login. So let's try all these. So let's try a user who doesn't exist yet in our database. So and this is exactly what we should see, user not found. And this is coming from the catch block in the promise chain. That's this guy right here. So in other words, this error was thrown by the Turbo SDK, and then we're properly rendering the error based on the message that Turbo threw right there. And that's exactly what we expect, because that user that we entered here doesn't exist. So that's good. So now let's try another user who does exist. So that would be LeBron James. But this time I'm going to enter the wrong password. And that's the proper error message. So that's good. So Turbo's handling the common scenarios that you would expect in a user login situation. And then last but not least, let's enter the right password. And then here we should see this block, which is returning the user data right back to us in the data object of the JSON response. So if this is successful, then I should see the full JSON of LeBron James, which is right there. So the login in this case was successful. So everything worked. So that's good. Now we have to properly handle the login situation. But before I do that, let me know if anyone has any questions, because I'm kind of moving at a brisk pace. So let me know if any of this isn't working for any of you guys, but hopefully it is. So okay, no questions? Everyone's good to go? Okay, so then let's see here. Oh, okay. So this isn't really logging in. It's really more just authentication. We want to actually keep the user logged in. So in other words, we need to somehow maintain the state of whether or not the user is logged in, which is normally done through sessions. So we want to do that. We want to set up a very simple session management system here. And we need to figure out if a user is logged in and then how to identify that user. Right. So what we want to do is set up a very simple get route in this file. So let's do a get route, and then we're going to call it current user. And this route, which is a get request, by the way, so we can test it in the browser. This route will identify if a user is logged in, and if so, tell us who that user is. And that's done through a session. And in this case, the session name is called vertex session. So the vertex session is really just a JSON object which you can bind objects to, which will persist across browser sessions. So what we want to do is set the vertex session. That's this guy right here. That's built into the Turbo scaffold. So what we want to do is check the session. So if initialize is null, right? So in this case, there is no user logged in. So response.json. So we just pass back null for the user. Okay, so there's no session at all. So that means obviously there's no user logged in, there's no session. Now, if there is a session, there could be any number of objects binded to that session. It might be a user, it might be any number of other things like a shopping cart, items in a shopping cart, things like that. So it might not be just for the user. So what we want to do is designate a specific key for the user on the session, which I'm just going to call user. So if the rec.vertex session.user is null, then no one's logged in, and we return null again. And then otherwise, so I'm just going to put a couple comments here. No one logged in. No one logged in again. And then here, someone is logged in. And then we just, for now, we're just going to return the user key of the vertex session, like that. So right now, even though we successfully authenticated on the login route, we didn't actually log the user in by persisting to a session. None of that actually happened. So right now, it's still, there's no one logged in. So if I check this path, so that's going to be /auth, /current user, I get no. That's exactly what I expect to see. So in other words, we have to actually set the session when certain things happen, right? A key question is, what are those things? Well, one of them is when the user logs in, pretty obviously. So if I go back to the login path, right here is successful login. Right, so here is where we should set the session. Set vertex session. We do rec vertex session, and then like I was saying earlier, it's just a JSON object, and we can apply any keys that we want to it. So what we want to do here is I'm going to choose the user key and then pass in just the ID. Now this data object right here is the full user JSON. So one of the keys in that JSON object is ID, which is basically the unique identifier in the database. So the database key, which I'm sure everyone has some familiarity with that concept. So I'm just going to set the database key to the ID on the vertex session, and that's it. This is going to be the entire user object. It's basically a JSON object with one key called ID, which corresponds to the user ID, and that's it. So when I successfully log in, this session will be set. So let's go ahead and try that. So the first thing we got to do is successfully log in. So let's log in. Okay, so I've successfully logged in. Now if I go to current user route, I now get the user ID, and that's this right here, which, by the way, corresponds to the user ID here. So it worked. So our user ID, at least, is being tracked right here. So that's good. That means it worked. So when I do current user, if I turn the browser off, well, I don't want to turn everything off, right? Otherwise, this broadcast will fail. But we want to do that. Okay. It's still logged in, so that's good. So that's great. Now on the current user get path, it's good that we're seeing the user ID, but we want a little bit more data. We want to grab the entire user JSON object. So we can just grab that using the turbo fetch command, and that's going to be this right here. We want to pass in the ID. So here we're telling Turbo to fetch a user. That's what we have. These are users based on this ID, which is a direct reference to this right here. And that should theoretically return the logged in user and the full data associated with that user. So we can confirm that, hopefully. And here we just pass in the data from the callback. And then here we do our usual error handling. So here I'm using another Turbo SDK command called fetch1. Again, you can always go back to the documentation if you're not sure what commands are available to you. The SDK isn't that complicated. It probably has about a dozen or so commands that come up over and over again. And I'm just reusing the more common ones. So here I'm using the fetch1. Well, this is the user stuff, so we want data store. This one right here. And the resource is a user, so we just pass in the resource name, which is user, and then the unique identifier, the database identifier. So right now, I'm currently logged in as LeBron James. So if I hit this endpoint, now I'm getting the full JSON of the currently logged in user. And yeah, that's it. So it worked. So hopefully you got that working as well. Again, I'm going a little bit speedy here. I'm just trying to get to the actual custom application logic. And this auth route, if you can see, it's pretty generic. So you can reuse this in other projects, which is good. So definitely feel free to do that. And last but not least, we got to handle logging out, which should also happen through a get. So I'm going to create one more get route, which will be log out. Okay, and same as before. It's just going to return initially JSON just to make sure it worked, right? So let's hit the logout endpoint, and we see that, which is good. Of course, we're not actually logged out because I didn't do anything, right? So let's go ahead and actually log the user out. So that's just resetting the session. So we do vertex session reset, and this will destroy the session. And then I'm going to pass back a user as null. And let's try it again. Okay, so the endpoint looks like it worked, but the only way to really tell is to go back to the current user route and we get null. So that means it worked. That means it really worked. So if I go back to the home page and I do another user, I'm now logged in as Steph Curry, and if I do current user, I should see Steph Curry. And if I log out like that, and if I go back to current user, it still returns null as the user, which is the correct behavior because the user is no longer logged in. So that's good. I'm going to do one more thing, which is very easy to miss. But if you think about it, when a user signs up, that should also register the user, right? Because it would be kind of awkward in a typical web application to sign up and then have to log in immediately after signing up. That would be kind of a strange user experience. So what I'm going to do here is on the register handler, I'm going to set the session on success right here. That way, registration will also log you in. So I'm going to register a whole new user. Register here. So let's see who's up next. Spell it right. Yeah. And then okay, so I'm registering a whole new user, and then I'm going to check the current user, which corresponds with the user I just signed up as. So that's good. That means I don't have to log in right after signing up, which is strange. Yeah, that's true. I think I'm seeing this more and more, Fantastic, because of like bogus emails and stuff like that. So really, what should happen? I mean, I don't want to get into it right now because it's going to take too much time. But we should send an email to the new user in order to confirm the actual email address, and then that should result in a random hash, typically some sort of like base encoded string, which then confirms the email and then logs the user in. That would be the most appropriate way to handle this because that confirms the email upon registration. Because what happens a lot is people sign up with bogus emails, or they just flat out misspell their email. That happens a lot too. So like every day on Turbo, I get around 10 new signups, and I would say I don't know, it's not quite 1 out of 10. So it might be like every day, every other day, an email fails, right? Because usually it's misspelled, like example@gmail.co, right? Or there are a lot of people who just give me bogus emails. I don't know why they do that. So that's why it's more. I'm saying more and more that this flow that I'm creating right here is oversimplified. So yeah, that's definitely a good point. Fantastic, thank you. So here we now have a pretty good user auth flow set up, which is gonna be good enough for our purposes. I would add a few more things in a real production application, but not much more. I would do that email authentication, and that's about it. So, so yeah, but this is good enough for us. We're not trying to, create Facebook or anything like that. So let's consider this sufficient for our purposes, and then let's see here. Let's create a new template for. Let's see here. So we have to consider now our resources, right? So that's why I defined the resources early on, right? We essentially just took care of this resource. We knocked that off our list, like that's done, right? So now let's move on to rooms, which are basically chat rooms divided by topic, subdivided by topic, right? So we need to create a template in order to create a room, just for testing purposes, right? So we should call it create room, or let's call it rooms.mustache for now. And again, this is all just for testing purposes. So we're going to replace all of this soon, probably by next session. But we just need some quick testing, right? So let's create a new template called rooms. And for now, let's copy and paste the index mustache over into that blank template, and then let's call this rooms. And then in this form, let's do create room. And obviously, we don't need the login form for this, so we can just ignore that. And we'll leave it alone like this for now. And then let's see here. We need to head over to the index route so we can create a route to serve that page, right? So let's go ahead and just create a simple, very, very simple route called rooms, which will render the rooms template. Pretty simple. So let's go ahead and run the dev server. And let's head over to the home page. And there it is. Okay. So obviously rooms don't have a username and password. So basically, let's say room. Let's see here. I guess category. Yeah, category. And that's description. There's probably a description. Description. Type this text. And then create. Okay, so that'll be the room schema. Obviously, it's grossly oversimplified, but again, for now, we're just setting things up, right? So we're going to have a category. So this will be like e.g., e.g. politics, and then description. Discuss politics of the day. Okay. And then that'll be, for now, what a room consists of. And now we need a way to actually create the room. So now this should happen through our REST API. So the REST API is generally for, to serve the resources in a consistent fashion. So we want to be able to fetch resources, create resources, update resources, and delete resources. So the quote unquote CRUD application, the CRUD processes. So that's going to happen through our API route right here, right? So let's go ahead and get rid of this sample. Actually, we shouldn't get rid of all of it. Let's just get rid of what's inside the default. And then we want to create a post. And then here we already have a resource parameter appended or applied to the path. Again, this should be ES6. That's just sloppiness on my part. So now here, let's do what we always do and set up and just return some JSON. Just to make sure everything works. So I always begin this way because it's very easy to make a simple mistake. Now, what we want to do is, excuse me, we want to take the form that we have here in the rooms.mustache and point it to this API handler. If you look at the app.js on the root directory of the project, the API handler is already connected. It's by default hooked up. So you don't have to do that, but it's important to understand like where that's taking place. So then here, we want to point the form to /API and then the resource name. So let's go ahead and do that. So we do /API right here, and it'll be room. And that should create a room. Now again, for now, it's just testing, right? So we're not going to actually create anything, but let's go ahead and see what happens. So here we reload. Sports. Let's talk about sports. And then here, when I hit create, I should see some JSON with just this data, and that's it. And there we go. Okay, great. So we're good to go on that. So simple enough. Let's go ahead and create this now in the actual backend. So here, we're going to use it, grab the Turbo SDK. I'm going to do create. It's going to be a room. And then same as always, the return the promise. So we just do our standard promise handling. Okay, now one thing to pay attention to is this right here. Now notice how on line 8, we're not doing create user, obviously, because we're not creating a user. We're creating a generic entity called room, which is an entity that we are making up. So that's a custom entity. Whereas the user entity is a non-custom entity, comes by default in the Turbo environment. It gives you an automatic room schema, which you can add your own stuff to. It's not set in stone. You can add your own custom properties to it. But by having a couple default schemas, certain things are taken care of for you, like hashing passwords and things like that. But however, this is not a default schema. It's not a default object. So here you have a lot more sort of wiggle room. So we just pass in the name of the resource, which is in our case room, and then the parameters, which is coming from the form, and then it'll create a room for us in the data store. So let's go ahead and test that. So we go back here. Sports. Here it is. Notice, by the way, there's more, a little bit more stuff that we didn't specify, like the ID and the timestamp. That means it's coming from the data store. In other words, we successfully created our first room. So if we actually go back to the data store, right here, here are our users that we created a while ago. And if we click on this, we now have room. And that's the room we just created. Now, if you look at this, there are a couple others like post and comment. And those are the default schemas, user, post, and comment. This is a blog post, and this is a comment. We're not going to use these two. We're going to just create our own. But that's why there's already stuff in here, in case you're wondering. So by default, there are 3 schemas, user, post, and comment. But by far, the most heavily used one is user. And then we can just add our own stuff down the road, which is what we just did right here. So here is our first room. And here are the attributes that we assigned to it. We can edit it, we can delete it, etc. But it worked. Everything here was successful. And now what I want to do is create, oops, this is a bit of a mistake though. We're hard coding the room schema here, which we don't want to do. So what we want to do is we want to grab the resource from the request parameters. In other words, we want to grab this parameter right here and pass that in like that. That way we can create an endpoint for any schema. So eventually we're going to create more resources, right? We don't want just a room. We want to create a topic and a reply, and we want this API wrap to handle all of those, right? So what I'm going to do up here is create a resources object. Yeah, object. Room topic reply and user. So these are the valid resources in our project. So we want to be pretty sure about it. Like, we don't want this to be too open, right? So what we want to do is say if resources index of the resource itself this is an invalid resource. In other words, this is a resource that our project does not currently support. So we want to throw back an error here saying invalid resource. That'll give us a little bit more protection against careless mistakes and things like that. Like if I do something silly like this, like ROM, right? We want to, sort of protect ourselves from ourselves, right? So here, if I go back to the rooms, if I try anything, I should get the error, invalid resource, and that's good, and that gives me some better protection. In fact, I'm going to take it one step further and actually include the resource. Right? Oh. Wow. That was a bad mistake. All right, let's try it again. You guys didn't catch that. I did params.params, so that's very, very silly. So let's try it again. There we go. So now here I'm literally pointing back the mistake I made so that I can quickly ascertain where I went wrong and then correct the mistake. Room. Okay. And let's try one more in the success scenario. So we did sports, fashion. And this one worked because the resource is a valid resource. It was included in the array. Therefore, it passed through and everything worked. So that's good to go. let's create a get handler for this. So I'm going to create a get handler. Same thing here. Let's just check to make sure the resource is valid before we actually send out any request. And then here, we're going to do a generic fetch command using the resource to specify which resource we want to fetch from the database. And then we can pass in a rec query here, but this can be null. So if it's null, then it will return, the data store will return all the entries in the as specified by the resource. If the rec query is not null, then it'll act as a filter. So we can say, give me all, users from New York, right? That's going to be a rec query filter. Give me all users who are male. Like those are going to be query filters. And then the rest is the same as always, which is the promise handlers. So now here, I can make a get request, and I will get both rooms currently in our database, which is great. The other valid resources are user, topic, and reply. So if I just go down that list, if I do topic, it should work, but I should get an empty array because there are currently no topics in the data store. Same as reply. So that's good. And if I do user, I should get, I think I'm on 3 right now. Yep, 1, 2, 3. So that was good. So the get request was successful. If you want to try to test the filter, we can do we can use the username as a filter. So this is the query object right here. If I pass in the filter, I will receive only the entities that match that filter. So if I type in LeBron James, I get LeBron James. If I type in gibberish, I get an empty array, which is exactly what I expect. And then let's create one more endpoint. I'm going to add one more endpoint to fetch a specific resource specified by the unique identifier. And I'm going to do the resource check just to make sure we're making a valid request in the first place. And then this time we're going to use the Turbo SDK to do fetch 1, which we used before, but we're going to pass in the resource because it could be any resource, and then pass in the ID from the URL string parameters, and then make the request that way. So here we can pretty much copy and paste the exact completion for the promises. So okay, so now we have okay, so here is the ID number of a specific room that we created, the fashion room, right? So based on the endpoint that we just wrote, we should be able to do localhost API room and then pass in the ID, and that should give us the fashion room data. And it did, so that's good. If we pass in, if we do the user request, we have all the users. If I grab an identifier of a specific user, there it is. If I enter an ID of a user that doesn't exist, it's not found. and that is this error right here, so that's good. If I enter in an invalid resource, if I do dog, invalid resource, dog, and that's it. So now we have our post, we have our get, we can fetch all the entities or a specific entity. The two things we left out are update and delete, which we will obviously get to eventually, but for now, this is going to be good enough to support our API. We can sign up and create a room. Notice, by the way, inside all of our routes, the actual direct references to the resource names never show up. In other words, the word room, user, topic, reply, they're nowhere in these route handlers. The only spot where those things even show up are right here, and that's it. So in other words, we can reuse this API route in any project and just update the valid resources. And that should take care of that. In reality, the more and more you do these projects, the more you can just reuse a lot of this code. So it's a very important sort of aspect of this, of what I've written so far as the API and the auth route are concerned, is that they're very generic. You can reuse them in other projects. Obviously, I built it from the bottom up so that you can see how things are organized and how they work. But if I were doing this project for my own purpose, if this was a client project or just my own personal interest project, I wouldn't do that. I would just reuse it from other projects. So hopefully that makes sense. So now we have a pretty serviceable API for our purpose. So what we want to do now is create a room. Now we have a room. So what we want to do is, let's see here, rooms. Let's create another template for a specific room. So if we go to the views directory and do room.mustache, open up the rooms template and create, just paste it in here. Now, if you think about it, we're sort of moving through the application from a functional standpoint, right? Like the first thing you're going to do is sign up, right? And then you create a room, and then you enter that room, right? So we're kind of going through this chronologically as an actual person would, right? So once you enter a room, what do you expect to see? You expect to see comments, or in our case, a series of topics, right? And then you should be able to click on a topic and reply and whatnot. So here, this template should render a list of topics. So we should do create topic. All right, so think about it from the standpoint of the rooms we've created so far. We've created the sports room and the fashion room. So if I enter the sports room, I should see a series of conversations relating to sports, organized by topic, basically a forum structure. So the next thing we want to do is create topic, and title description is what we went with here, right? So let's go with title. And this is already description, so we do topic. And that should be it, because keep in mind, our API is already designed to handle this resource, right? Because of that right there. So we're pretty much done with this. So if I actually, oh, one more thing. If we go to the index route, we want to create another one for room. I should have just called this topics, but it's all the same. Okay, so let's head over to that template and create topic. So again, these are sort of conversation starters from within a room, right? So if I'm in the sports room, the topic should be something relating to sports, right? So right now it's we're approaching college basketball tournament, right? So March Madness. Uh, who favorite teams in March? Okay, so here I'm creating a topic revolving around March Madness. So again, if you go to the actual, if you just go to Reddit, and so here is the main Reddit page. If I enter a room, which is a sub, so if I enter a sub, right? So if I do, so these would be rooms in our case. Let's do funny. These are the topics. Okay, so these are going to be the topics in our case. So here is the topic. So I'm going to create the topic, and here it is. And again, notice how we didn't have to do any more coding on the back end because our API has been designed sort of, originally to handle all kinds of resources, or not all kinds of resources, the valid resources in our project. So it's already set to go. If we look at the actual callback, we have our schema, the timestamp, the unique identifier, and the actual data. If I make a GET request to this endpoint, it's already supported by our API again, which is great. If I grab the specific ID and make a GET request here, I have the specific topic fetched. If I go back here and I do a filter, let's do there's really not much to filter on, so whatever, you get the idea. All right, so our topic works. Now, if you look at the actual page from where we created that topic, you'll see that we create topics in a room, and that room might be sports or fashion or politics or whatever. But if you look at the actual topic created, we didn't, that's not included in here. There's no way of knowing from this data what room this topic was created in. So that's no good. So let's go ahead and fix that. So in here, let's create another input. That's going to be a hidden input, which obviously won't have a description. The name will be room. The value will be room. So here we're now using the Mustache templating engine to get inject some data dynamically. So inside here, what we should do is pass in some data with the room key like that. I'm going to hard code it at 1, 2, 3 for now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just to make sure it works, right? So if I reload this page and I check the source, here is the room value I passed in using the Mustache templating engine. So that worked. That's good. However, there's nowhere on this request or page, really anywhere, that specifies the actual room. So what we want to do is create a means of doing that. So here, the route should actually be room ID. And then we should pass that in here, rec params ID. So this route will no longer work. If I try this, I should get an error. And then if I pass in this, now I have the template rendering. But if I actually look at the source code, there it is. You see how it matches? Hopefully you can see that, right? So that way I can pass in the room ID here, and that will bind the room ID to the topic that you create. So let's try it again. So if I do that, and then this is politics, right? So Trump. Okay, so I'm creating a new topic in room 123, 123. So if I create that, now the room is actually added to the data, and which will then show up in the data store with that corresponding value. So now I click on room. Oops, I'm sorry, not room, topic. My mistake, excuse me. And here it is. But notice how the first one doesn't have it because we created it before we made the adjustment. So let's actually go ahead and get rid of this. So we can just delete that, and that will take care of that. So now we're good to go. And if I make a request, here it is. Great. So now things are pretty well set up. We didn't set up the reply, but I'm pretty sure you can see how that's going to work. So from a data standpoint, from an organizational standpoint, our app is pretty well constructed. I'm going to do a quick deploy. Just to make sure everything works on staging, because obviously that's more important than local. All right, let's try this guy out. So let's go over here to the staging URL, and let's start this guy out from scratch. So let's register a whole new user and all that stuff. So let's do let's see, Blake Griffin. Okay, so I'm signing up a whole new user. Here is data from the data store, so that looks like it's successful. If I actually check the data store, I should see that new user, and there he is. Now remember, we set it up so that when the user signs up, he also logs in, right? So if we try auth current user, I should see Blake Griffin, and I do, so that's successful. If I log out, that's back to null, and current user is back to null. This is the same data store as what we had on local, so we can test users from before. So Steph Curry, and then password. That's good to go. We can hit the endpoints, the API endpoints. So API room. Here are the two rooms. Topic, one topic, user. Everything looks pretty good so far. So we are set to go. So basically what we've done in this session is we've set up the organizational structure to deliver and create data and eventually update data. There's been basically zero UI consideration. So these templates are temporary. In fact, starting next session tomorrow, these are gonna be gone, and we're gonna start setting up the actual visual organization. So we're gonna start setting up the actual UI UX and making it look more like it's supposed to look, rather than just having all these test templates or just some quick data. I didn't do the reply setup because I'm guessing by now you can kind of figure out how that would work. But we're just going to get to that from the actual project design, UI UX design, starting tomorrow, and start actually creating rooms and comments and topics and replies and all that good stuff. and then filling out the app, more from a more practical standpoint, and making it look nice. So I went a little fast in this video. Hopefully that wasn't too fast for you. I find this whole setup phase sort of the boring part. So I just kind of want to get through it so that we can get to the good stuff, which is setting up the UI and making it look cool and all that stuff. So hopefully you were able to follow. And if you have any questions or comments or anything like that, please shoot me a message on Slack or just shoot me an email. Or shoot me an email right there. And that's it. Hopefully you're able to follow this video, and I appreciate you joining this session. So catch you in the next one tomorrow.